Thank you. That's okay. You got the Berg. I'm Scott Bloomberg. I'm a vice president at NERA Economic Consulting. The work that I've been doing energy and environmental issues for about the last 15 years. The work that I present here today, some of it is related to work that I have been involved with that's been funded by National Association of Manufacturers and also the TCEQ. The goal of my presentation is really about giving a sense for how do we calculate the compliance costs and what are the challenges in doing that. It is quite a daunting task, and because of that we get a wide range of potential outcomes. There's just a lot of areas for uncertainty, and we're going to go through several of them, but we're talking about, what does the future baseline level of ozone look like by region or even by monitor? How responsive are these monitors to changes in NOx and VOC emission levels? We use that information, or EPA used that information, to try to figure out just how many tons of NOx, for the most part, there's a few areas that are VOC sensitive, that need to be reduced and where they need to be reduced. And then, once you know how many tons, well, how much are they each going to cost? So what are the technologies that we can use to make those reductions? So we're going to go through, I'm going to go through basically EPA's methodology, which is, if anyone wants more details, it's encompassed in their RRAA, 575 pages. I'm sure you've all read it. And then we'll go through an alternative approach as well that basically takes different assumptions with respect to some of the uncertainties. So the chart I'm showing here, this is historical NOx emissions, again, NOx being the most important factor leading to the ozone. From 1990 through 2013, this is for the entire U.S. You can see that we have made very significant reductions. It's about 50% reduction over the 23 years. A lot of these have come from big sources, electric generators, large point sources, the big manufacturers, particularly the pollution, or at least the formerly pollution-intensive manufacturers. Then if we look out to the future, EPA put together projections for 2018 and 2025, and the focus is going to be on 2025 in their analysis. That's when they really wanted to see when attainment, what attainment would look like and how much it would cost. So EPA projects about a 40% decline in NOx emissions from 2011 through 2025. A lot of that is on-road emissions as well as some electric sector. And a lot of that is Tier 2 fuel standards, and as you get closer, last part of this decade, Tier 3. So there's a lot of reductions going on. Now if you look at the red line, that's where we estimate you need to get to. Now I will say that presenting the entire U.S., it doesn't look like there's such a big difference between that dash blue line in 2025 and that red line. Some of this is kind of hidden because this shows all U.S. emissions, but not every area has to make reductions. So I think the first presentation yesterday morning showed something for the San Joaquin Valley, where it was showing just how far it had to go, and it was pretty low. That's going to be the case in certain areas that need to make the reductions. So that's important to keep in mind. And when I show emissions throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm going to zero in more so on those states that EPA said made reductions. So it will be more focused, and you'll see more of a difference. Okay, so how did EPA go about calculating the costs? Basically, it starts with that, I talked about that 2025 baseline projection of emissions, and that goes into a model. It's a national scale air quality model, the CAMEX model. Please don't ask me to describe it. There's probably a few people in here who can, but I'm not one of them. But it projects, puts in emissions, where emission sources are, meteorology, a lot of other factors to get those chemical reactions that we talk about. And then it projects ozone monitor values at different points in the U.S. So what we see in the chart here, and this is right out of the RIA, counties that are in red, those are counties that in 2025 EPA projected would have a design value in excess of 70 ppb, and then counties in green would be above 65. So the 65, for the rest of this presentation, that's really what I'm focusing on. I'm looking at what are the costs associated with attaining 65 ppb at all monitors, well, almost all monitors, in the U.S. So to figure out the reductions that were required, EPA also used this CAMEX model, did different sensitivity runs where they put in reductions in different quantities in different locations to see how sensitive different monitors were to reductions. And using that information, they could better estimate just how many reductions were necessary to get, we'll say every monitor, but it's not quite every monitor, as I'll explain. Another important issue, and I know this was talked about yesterday morning, is the role of background ozone. First, let's define it. I wasn't here for the first few presentations, so I'm not sure if that was gone into yesterday. But basically, background is emissions from natural sources, so not man-made, as well as man-made emissions that are outside the U.S. Basically, the U.S. has little to no control over. And as was discussed yesterday, it's higher mainly in the Intermountain area and because of the emissions from Canada and Mexico, also along the border areas. So this is relevant here. Certain of the border areas in Texas, probably more relevant, I think, based on some weather patterns. This has implications for the cost that I'll be calculating as well. Mainly because if you're at higher background level, typically you get a lower responsiveness to every ton of NOx that you reduce. And if you're getting lower responsiveness, then you have to reduce more tons. The more tons you do, typically you're moving up a marginal cost curve, so it's a higher cost per ton, and then multiplied by more tons, higher cost. So the one thing I did want to mention as well, background has implications for the ability to attain as well. We may see some maps later on, but there's some counties that EPA just threw out of their analysis. They kind of ignored because they couldn't get them into attainment. That includes 3 counties here in Texas. Brewster, which I think is along the border, Randall, which I'm not sure why it was thrown out. It's, I think, more in the northern part of the state, and then El Paso, which is in the southwest border. So once EPA identified just how many tons it needed to reduce, the next step is figuring out, well, what can be used to make those reductions. So EPA uses the language, I didn't make this up, so don't blame me, known controls and unknown controls. So known controls, basically these are existing technologies, they're available today, and typically they're what I would call a retrofit. So you're putting something on existing equipment. EPA has a few different sources for this information. They have a cost model, control strategy tool, the IPM model, the assumptions there, that's used for electric sector reductions, mainly through SCRs. And also they have a non-road model that models the potential for non-road reductions, so agricultural equipment and construction equipment, things of that nature. These known controls, they were put across different source categories. The only source where EPA did not identify any known controls was the on-road category, and that was mainly because their baseline includes Tier 3, which is already getting, well, it's projected to reduce on-road emissions fairly significantly. I think that starts 2017, maybe fully implemented about 2025. So there really wasn't anything more there. EPA put these known controls pretty much anywhere. It didn't matter so much if the area was in attainment or not. It mattered if it had emissions and if they could be controlled. And the costs of these, there's a full list of them, line item by line item. But the cost of these, except for a handful of SCRs, the cost of these controls was less than $14,000 per ton. Unknown controls, they are basically what what you think they are. We don't know what they are. Nobody knows what they are. EPA in the RIA did not specify, categories of what these might be or anything of that nature. So it's presumed that they would be distributed across source categories. They were put in at a regional level, so they were only put in regions where there was non-attainment. And they were basically put in after known controls were put in. So put in what we know, and then we'll get down to what we know we need to get down to through the unknown controls. Oh, and I guess sorry, I forgot to mention the nice lead-in. The cost of these unknown controls. EPA assumed an average cost in all locations of $15,000 per ton. And EPA provided many different items to support this cost. This is a big uncertainty, as we'll see as we continue through the rest of the presentation. They looked at their known controls. They said, well, 96% of the known controls cost less than $15,000. And to be honest, it's basically 100% since they set a cutoff of $14,000, except for a few SCRs. They said that the average cost of their known controls was about $3,400. They said that their known controls, they only looked into controls in selected sectors. So presumably there would be similar kinds of controls in these other sectors that would appear in the unknown controls, but they just weren't identified. They stated that sometimes they overstayed the costs, so they didn't want to go too high. They talk about how baseline emissions can be overstated because of other regulations that are unrelated to ozone. The examples given for were, so for example, in the 2025 baseline, the emissions come down because of electric sector policies, the mercury and air toxic standard, which led to coal retirements for the most part, and also the proposed Clean Power Plan, which is still a proposed rule, and then also Tier 3 that we mentioned before. So to the extent that there are other policies enacted between now and 2025, that would lower what they say is the baseline in 2025. They looked at the dollars per ton for other NOx rules that have been imposed over the last 10 or 15 years, and they range from $2,200 a ton to about $11,000 per ton. They looked at NOx offset prices in some regions. So for example, I think Houston has a NOx offset price. And this would be for the current 75 ppb standard, and they said, well, those costs are less than $15,000 per ton. And then they talk a lot about technology innovation over time, diffusion. Environmental policy can create incentives for technological change. I think that was one of the papers that Professor Milmet presented, the more R&D. And then they also talked about, well, cost changes associated with technological change, those would be available nationally. There's no reason to think that that would just be isolated locally. So that's why we use the same cost in every region, that there aren't any regional differentiation. So what I've done is I've summarized, basically going into the RIA, going into backup files, the NOx emissions and the costs that are implied by, not even implied, that are from EPA's RIA. And again, here I want to mention, this is just now states where EPA made reductions. So we're at, and this is in 2025. So EPA has this base case and baseline, and it confused me for probably a good month or so, just understanding the difference. But they had this base case, which was their projection of emissions, and then they added in some additional controls. First was for compliance with 75 ppb, so that was some additional controls in Texas and California. And then they also put in the proposed clean power plan, so the electric sector CO2 proposed policy. And those together brought base case emissions down from 6.3 million tons to 5.7 million tons in these set of states. So we'll focus everything on baseline going forward here. So baseline, 5.7 million tons. And again, I want to mention that this is compliance with 65 ppb. I think, that there is uncertainty within the proposed rule, 60, 65, 70. I think they said they take comment on keeping the standard, but this is for 65 ppb. So from that baseline, they identified known controls. Those were basically the retrofits around the country. That was about 900,000 tons. They also identified SCR controls on coal-fired power plants. That was about 200,000 tons. And then unknown controls to get down to what was necessary was about 900,000 tons. So total reductions from the baseline, about 2 million tons. And you can see that of that, 900,000 of it, or about 45%, is coming from unknown controls. So unspecified, don't really know what it is. If we look at the cost side of things, the known controls were about 1.6 billion. This is in 2011 dollars, and these are annualized costs. So you can more so think of them in terms of, you can convert annualized costs to dollars per ton more easily. The electric sector costs about 1.7 billion, and then the unknown control costs about 13 billion. So a total cost of about $16 billion annualized. And again, here it's more than 80% of the costs are from unknown controls. So it's a very large uncertainty, which has a very big impact on the cost here. And I'll mention the Texas share of costs mainly because later on in the presentation we'll zero in on Texas as well. Texas's share of costs were about $4 billion, so about 25% of the total national costs are in Texas. I think this slide here, I think, is getting to a question that we had, I think it was Andrew, in the previous session. There's a lot of requirements when an area is designated in non-attainment. This slide, I don't know if you can really read that well. There's a link to it if you want. But depending on how an area is classified, there's different requirements. I think Andrew mentioned transformation, conformity, vehicle inspection and maintenance. You get up to moderates. You have to do a SIP. There's reasonable further progress. So there's a lot of factors. And then there's also this non-attainment NSR. So this is where I think the growth issue comes into play that I think you were also getting at. So for new sources or modified sources, if they want to go into a non-attainment area, and let's say they're going to have 1,000 tons of NOx emissions, they would need to offset that, and it's not at 1-to-1 ratio. That ratio depends on the severity of the area designated, but it ranges from 1.1 to 1. So in a marginal area, you would need 1,100 tons to offset of offsets to if you were going to emit 1,000 tons. And if you were extreme area, you'd need 1,500 tons. So it adds an additional cost to locating in those areas. And in addition to the non-attainment NSR, I think we talked briefly about transportation conformity, and that has implications for basically the availability of federal highway funds and getting approval of all of your transportation projects and probably delaying them as well. So all of those things have costs. Now the cost that I just showed for the EPA analysis, that doesn't include any of these costs. The costs that I'll show for an alternate analysis, that is not included in there. I think, as Professor Milmet suggested, it's just really hard to estimate what that cost is. It's kind of a hypothetical. Well, if it had been built here, the growth would have been a little bit higher. But because it wasn't, it's here. But it's hard to observe. So just keep in mind that when I'm showing the costs, what I'm showing are direct compliance costs, and it's not these indirect costs, which I think can be significant, but they're very hard to quantify. So we've showed the EPA. What I want to do is zero in on a few different uncertainties and take an alternate view of these. So we'll go through these one by one, and I'll talk about each one in a little bit more detail. So the first one is the baseline emissions should not include reductions from the proposed clean power plan, which is highly uncertain. It's proposed for a reason. So what would this do? Basically, if those reductions were not in the baseline would be higher, but we'd still need to get down to the same set of compliance tons. So we would need to get those reductions from somewhere else, and presumably that would come from unknown controls, because we've basically exhausted all of the known controls in all regions of the country. The second area of uncertainty is compliance emissions. EPA focused in on the year 2025. That's when they did an emission forecast. Their explanation was, well, by 2025, everybody would pretty much have to be in compliance, so we'll look at that. The issue is the timing of the rule, and this is included in the RIA, really suggests that most states, or most areas, with the exception of, I think it was Utah, sorry, Mr. Packham, and California, they would be designated likely as marginal or moderate, which would suggest attainment by 2023, which would really suggest that you have to have everything in place by 2022. So because the emissions forecast is declining over time, mainly because of reductions in on-road emissions, if you move up the attainment date, you're not getting these, what I'll call free reductions that are happening in the baseline, but they're happening in the future. So again, if you have to get more reductions because your baseline is higher, that's going to have a higher cost. The third one, and likely the most significant, is the cost for unknown controls. I went through a lot of support that EPA provided for why they chose $15,000 per ton, and I'll go through some reasons why that might not be a good number. And obviously, if that's a higher cost, we still would have the same number of unknown controls, so that would translate to higher compliance costs. And the last uncertainty that I'll go into is the regional nature of EPA's analysis. EPA is not responsible for doing compliance. The compliance and the preparation of the SIPs and how you get to compliance and attainment, that's up to the states. But a few of the things that they did in their analysis, they made it much more regional than is likely possible. Basically putting some controls in regions well outside the non-attainment area, including sometimes in states that are completely in attainment, which is hard to see how that would happen. I think there are some provisions in the Clean Air Act, but I'm not sure if they've ever been done, certainly for ozone. So that would result in likely higher compliance costs in the non-attainment areas and potentially offset, maybe not 100%, but it would certainly be offset by lower costs in areas that are in attainment. Okay, so the first uncertainty I mentioned, Clean Power Plan is a proposed policy. It was proposed last summer. It's expected to be finalized this summer. Probably as soon as it's finalized, it will be litigated. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to, one, I guess the litigation could certainly delay the policy, and I think there's a lot of people who feel that it could be struck down. I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure that there are at least a few people in here who could probably go on for a long time about the likely legal validity of the Clean Power Plan, but I'm not going to do that. But the implication is if we take it out, EPA estimated that there was about 430,000 tons of reductions from the Clean Power Plan. Now, only about 300,000 of those were in non-attainment states. So, some of those would not, some of those tons would not have any impact on costs. But there would be about 300,000 tons, and about 80,000 in Texas. That, again, the baseline would go higher. We still need to get down to the same level of attainment tonnage. So there would be a cost roughly equal to the 300,000 tons. Again, if that were at EPA's unknown control cost of $15,000 per ton, that would add annualized costs in the U.S. of about $4.5 billion, and in Texas of about $1.2 billion. Second uncertainty we talked about, timing. So EPA focused on 2025. In the RAA, the timing for attainment for marginal, EPA said it's 2020, maybe early 2021, and moderate would be 2023. The figure I show here, this is how the emissions come down over time. Again, this is just in states where reductions had to be made. But between 2018, which was a year that EPA also did an explicit emission forecast, and 2025, emissions are coming down by about 1 million tons. So, for example, if you looked at what was the tons, just doing some kind of linear interpolation because we don't have an actual emissions forecast for that year. But if we looked at 2023, that tonnage would be higher by about 270,000 tons. Similar to the Clean Power Plan, we're raising up our baseline, keeping the attainment level in the same place. So we need to make 270,000 tons of additional reductions. In Texas, it's about 25,000, so not quite as bad as the Clean Power Plan for Texas. But that cost, again, it's basically another $4 billion, and that's at EPA's costs of the $15,000 per ton. And that'd be about $0.4 billion in Texas. I want to talk a little bit more about timing because I'm not sure we really have yet in the workshop. So the proposed rule came out, I think it was the day before Thanksgiving in the afternoon last year. It was a great little Thanksgiving present. The final rule, I think by some legal agreement, is required is October of this year. It's expected that areas would be designated in 2017. So presumably those designations would be based off of 2016 design values. So the monitored values average over the 3-year 2014 to 2016. If an area is classified as marginal, they would look to be demonstrating attainment in 2020, maybe early 2021. Moderates would be 2023. Serious, severe 15, extreme are further out in time. I will tell you that when we looked at the projected design values of all the states that had non-attainment areas, all of them except for 2 we expected to be designated as marginal or moderate. So I want to focus more on that side of the graph. There's also the possibility, if you're a marginal state, you could reclassify. Did I say if you were moderate? If you're marginal, you could reclassify to moderate if you didn't think that you were necessarily going to be in attainment in 2020, but maybe because of declining baseline emissions, you might be without really having to do anything in 2023. That might happen. There is a trade-off because there are additional requirements for moderate classifications as opposed to marginal, so it's a trade-off. And then when we talk about timing, and this has implications for the costs, we can't just say, oh, well, we have to show attainment in 2023, so we're going to put all of our spending in 2023, and then we'll be fine. all of the spending and all of the equipment really needs to be in place before the ozone season, let's say in 2022, such that the 2022 monitor value would be an attainment. If the 2022 monitor value is an attainment, even if the design value for the 3 years is not yet at the 65 ppb, there is the potential to get a couple of one-year extensions. So that might be a least cost kind of compliance approach. But the earlier spending, spending in 2022, and to be honest, if you have to put capital in place by the beginning of 2022, that spending, particularly for larger capital projects, that's happening, well before 2022, whether it's, validating the technologies, making sure they work with your plant or whatever it is. That spending begins well before, and that has implications for the present value of costs. I don't really present the present value. I think Ann might in the next presentation, but that has implications. Okay, the next uncertainty, and this is probably the big one, is the unknown control costs. So EPA said they would be $15,000 per ton. I went through their list of why they thought that. It relies heavily, I would say, on technological progress and learning by doing. And both of those are very uncertain. The other aspect is the timing side of things. So areas get designated in 2017. Well, they have to start scrambling. If you're a marginal, you would have, maybe 2-3 years to get your controls in place. So those controls need to almost exist by then. There isn't a lot of time to develop new things. Even with the moderate designation, that's 5 or 6 years, but that's not a lot of time for what I would say might need to be large leaps in technological improvement if you want your costs to be at $15,000 per ton. The other thing is the argument in the RIA this time, it's a change from what they presented in the 2008 and 2010 reviews, where they also included the cost of unknown controls based on what they called a hybrid approach. And under the hybrid approach, they had increasing marginal costs for these unknown controls. And it was a function of the ratio of known controls in an area to unknown controls. Basically, if you have more unknown controls as a share of your total control strategy, you'd have a higher slope, which makes a lot of economic sense. There's a lot more uncertainty, and you have to be delving into areas where maybe there aren't controls as much. So that makes a lot of sense, but they went away from that this time. They had also talked about, well, they didn't look at all sectors, but I think, a question is, I guess, why didn't they? As we'll see as we look at other, cost estimates, but even within their cost estimate, this is a huge uncertainty, and it just seems like maybe based on the level of the uncertainty, the time wasn't spent to try to identify more of those controls, to give a more refined cost estimate. So what I wanted to do was try to take a look at, well, we know we need to get about 1 million tons. So where can we get these 1 million tons from unknown controls? So the first place to look is, well, what tons are remaining after we take away these known controls? And this is with a slightly different, this is not the EPA control strategy. You can see that with the EGU, because this is based off of analysis that NERA did. But there's more reductions in the EGUs. Basically, we took more reductions from coal-fired power plants with either retirements or SCRs. But basically, the electric sector, coal plants have been shut down. They're controlled. You can't get too much more there. The manufacturing, the other industrial, these are large point sources that have been hit with the bulk of required reductions from the earlier ozone standards. So they're already heavily controlled for the most part. Commercial and residential sectors, there are some emissions there, but they're spread out everywhere, and that would be very hard to regulate and very costly to regulate and I think, ensure compliance, which the states would have to do. On-road, as I mentioned, this is it's the largest remaining sector or source of emissions after we take away the known controls. This is your passenger vehicles, your light-duty vehicles, and your trucking. So passenger vehicles, light-duty vehicles, this already has Tier 3 standards in place. So there's not too much more you can do there, and EPA has acknowledged that. And then trucking is very difficult to regulate at the state level, particularly interstate trucking. You're not exactly sure where the emissions are going to be. They could be in a wide range of places. So then non-road is the second largest source category. A third of those emissions are from freight rail. Like interstate trucking, a lot of that goes across state lines, so that would be very difficult to regulate. And then other sources, other large sources within there are construction equipment and marine vessels, which again, very, very challenging for a state to regulate. The challenges there add to the cost because there's a lot more sources. It was a lot easier when you could go to a coal plant and say, you need to put on an SCR, and you get, a couple, 100,000 tons or something like that. It might cost a decent amount, but you're getting a lot of tons. Here, you might have to go to, thousands of different sources. So that's quite a bit more challenging. And a lot of those sources are not necessarily, you don't necessarily have, direct monitoring or some means to verify. So what I've done here is just a hypothetical. Again, we need 1 million tons or so I just allocated them. I allocated them to all the sectors or all the source categories except for the electric generators, and I did it in proportion to what their remaining emissions were. So I think the question, you start to see, okay, well, I need to get 200,000 or 300,000 tons from this different source category. You start to rack your brain and say, well, what's in there, and how do I do that? And it's not at all obvious. Certainly wasn't obvious to the EPA because they, really didn't make any specification of what these unknown controls might be, and it's not obvious to us either. And then there is some question about some of these emissions, even for example whether a state has the authority to regulate. I think one example is the ability to regulate non-road engines. I think is limited, at least with respect to retrofits. I think states might be able to impose daily emission limits, operating characteristics, but I believe I've been told that they might not be able to specify that you have to put on a retrofit. So that can, there's a question of how many of these tons are even in the available pool to be addressed. Another category I think would be airline emissions. I'm not sure that you can regulate those. Plus they're going obviously across state lines. So what we tried to do is try to come up with a more fact-based approach to calculating what the cost of some of these unknown controls might be. And what we looked at was the vehicles, in particular passenger and light-duty trucks. There's pretty good information on the vehicle stock that's expected to be present in 2022, 2025, and also the emissions that are coming from different vintages of cars. The vintages, the key distinctions for the most part being Tier 1 cars, which I think is maybe 2005, 2006 and earlier, and there's a surprising amount of them that are still expected to be around 20 years later. Tier 2, which I think is about 2006 until about 2017, and then Tier 3 phases in 2017, 2018, and comes into play and is mostly fully implemented by 2025. What we saw was about 40% of the remaining emissions in 2022, 2025 were coming from light-duty trucks and passenger cars that are Tier 1. So these are your oldest cars. And so what we did was we looked at what would be the cost to take those off of the road. And there was some research that was done by Greenstone. He was mentioned in the previous presentation. He does a lot of research. And we used some of that, and we looked at, well, we got a few different price points. And what we found was we could reduce about 10% of the vehicle emissions for about $50,000 per ton. So certainly not cheap. And if we wanted to get all 40%, it was about $235,000 per ton. And what we did was we assumed that the other, mostly mobile sources and these other small sources would have a similar pattern of costs. And one big reason for that is for all of these, really the way to get the reductions is to turn over the capital stock. It's not to slap on some retrofit. For the most part, that's what's been identified. So turning over capital stock, which still has a useful life, is quite expensive. So that's why we tried to use the information we gleaned from the vehicles and apply it more generally. So what we got is, and I'll explain this, this is just an illustrative cost curve for the unknown controls. But what you see in the x-axis, this would be 100% of an area or states, however you want to do it, emissions. First thing we do is remove the known controls. These were costs between $0 and $15,000 per ton. The next thing we do, it's not labeled here, but between the costs of $15,000 and $30,000 roughly, was reductions in the electric sector. And then we're at about $30,000 per ton, and we have that remaining emissions that we were just looking at. And so what we did was we identified a point. We said 40% of those remaining emissions, we estimate a cost of $235,000 per ton, and we draw a line. It's an estimate. There's probably some shape. I'm not sure which way. But what you see is a very big difference. So the line with our 235,000 at 40%, upward sloping. What you see and what you want to compare that to is the dashed red line. So that is the EPA's costs. So that's at $15,000 per ton. So it's quite a bit lower, and that's going to explain a whole lot of difference in cost that we'll see on the next slides. The last uncertainty that I want to talk about is regional scope. So EPA, I talked about, did things at very much a regional level. But obviously the states that will be putting together the SIPs don't necessarily have that benefit. So what we did, and this is for some preliminary work that we've done for TCEQ, was try to refine the estimates for Texas. So we split Texas into two, basically, East Texas and West Texas, where East Texas is defined by the orange and blue counties in the map, and that those counties were identified as being within 200 kilometers of Monders, above 70 ppb in the EPA base case. We include some additional controls on engines and boilers in Houston, so a little bit different. We had a little different information. We refined the electric sector reductions. Basically, we forced all coal-fired generators in East Texas to retire. And then we took some reductions that EPA was making in Arkansas and Mississippi, particularly unknown controls, and instead we said, no, those really don't belong in that state, or those states, because those states are in attainment in the base case. It's not clear why you would put them there. So we moved them into Texas. We adjusted for the fact that by making reductions closer to the Monders, you actually get to make fewer reductions. But those were the adjustments we made. I will say that EPA had known and unknown control costs in all Texas counties, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it probably has some implications that we could have refined further, but we didn't. The reductions, we talk about a few counties that, the counties in red, the counties in green, those are the ones at the monitor levels above 65. It necessarily means that you have to go beyond those counties. There are just not enough emissions in those counties. Frankly, there are not enough emissions in the surrounding counties. So in Texas, we identified a need to make about 560,000 tons of reductions. The entire state was about 900,000. The emissions in the counties above attainment, or projected to be above attainment, was about 260,000. So how far from these counties can you go, will you go, which will really be a state issue, but it's an important consideration. Just a little bit more on this. I'm going to skip through this in the event of time, just go pretty quickly. Chart on the left, this is NOAQS by county. Chart on the right is the annualized cost. What you see by us splitting the state in two is that we concentrate the costs in the area that has the non-attainment issue. It just didn't make sense to put more of that cost outside of that area, which effectively is what EPA did. Okay, so pretty quickly, I want to go through what we did in Texas, and then we'll get to putting all this together and what it means for the US, and then we'll compare. So here we split East Texas and West Texas. Again, this is compliance with 65 ppb. We see a lot more reductions in East Texas. It starts off, the emissions, baseline emissions are about double, but once we make all the reductions, East Texas and West Texas, the emissions are not all that different. But we do see these known controls in West Texas. We do see some unknown controls in West Texas, and it's not clear why they're there. We did not move them. EPA put them there because West Texas did not have any monitors that EPA considered for the analysis to be above 65 ppb in the analysis. They had 3 counties, but they threw them out for mainly for background reasons. But when we look at the reductions, East Texas is making about a 70% reduction, which you would think that's going to lead to higher costs than if it's more spread out, if we push some of those reductions to areas that don't need to make as much reduction. So by pulling them in, we think that should lead to a higher cost. And we do see the unknown reductions. It's 56% in East Texas, about 45% statewide. So that's fairly significant as well. This chart here, and then we'll wrap up. This is a similar chart to what we saw for the EPA analysis. This, again, it just includes the states that made reductions. We start with a base case to be consistent with EPA, but to get down to a baseline, we only removed the 75 ppb compliance actions. We did not do the Clean Power Plan because we don't think that's appropriate. The known controls, basically the same as what EPA did, same cost. We did more electric sector controls. We do not include those costs when we're calculating the costs. That's done within modeling, and it's just hard to separate out. But it would include the cost of dispatching maybe higher cost units and also building new units to replace the units that retire. And then unknown controls. Again, we have that 1 million tons or so nationally to get down to the same compliance emissions that EPA had. But because we didn't have some of those reductions that EPA had in its baseline, we end up with total reductions of about 2.6 million tons. But the big item and the big difference is the cost of those unknown controls. With the alternative approach for the unknown controls, this is an estimate that says the unknown controls themselves are $153 billion, again, annualized cost, with total cost of $155 billion. And within Texas, the costs are about $54 billion, or roughly 1/3 of the total national costs. So very large difference. And to wrap up, there's a lot of uncertainties. We went through a few, and I think what was talked about maybe earlier today, this is really complex stuff. So you're going to get a lot of uncertainty. But it's important to bring that uncertainty forward and be more transparent about it. So, we talked about uncertainties about baseline emissions projections and also the timing. That has implications for how many tons we need to reduce. So that provided a range, 2 to 2.6 million tons. Primarily uncertainties about unknown control costs resulted in that wide range of annualized compliance costs, 16 billion to about 155 billion. And looking down at Texas, all those uncertainties we just discussed, but also that regional focus, which is how this rule will eventually be implemented at whatever level it's selected, that leads to a range of costs in Texas of between 4 billion and 54 billion. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty. Thank you.
Questions for Scott, especially from the panel? Oh, we have a question.
Have you done 7?
Oh, yeah, then-
So much of it's on the unknown, but have you done a comparable analysis for 70 or 60? 60 would be scary, I suspect.
60
but
is-
70 would.
Yeah, we have not looked at 70. Last year, we did a study that did look at 60. It was before some of the additional information with the proposed rule was made available, and it was fairly scary. It's publicly available. I think the slides may have, actually I don't know if they have a link to it, but it's on NERA's website, where I could send you a link.
But you haven't, but the 70 you haven't done?
We have not looked at 70.
Okay.
I'm so appalled, it's hard to even frame a question. But I think the national regulator is looking toward the new round, there's a round every 5 years, as relating to climate. And have you looked at the implications of trying to control CO2?
I think the EPA's inclusion, for example, of that Clean Power Plan, which is the
Oh,
CO2,
okay.
it's a proposed CO2 rule for the electric sector
Okay.
under Section 111D. That was one way to get that in. To the extent, and I guess the baseline also includes CAFE standards for the light-duty vehicle fleet going out to 2025 when I think the cars are going to average 55 miles per gallon. That's
Right.
already built into the baseline as well. So some of that is built in, but other of that I think would be addressed. I think one of the EPA comments is potentially the baseline could be lower if there are additional regulations put in place that either directly lower NOx emissions
Right.
or indirectly through CO2 regulations or
Yeah,
others.
and I think also a thing that's being looked at, there's always this question, what's the next big thing, that we're going to do? Because if there's not a next big thing, you don't have anything to do. And I think the visibility people, we're looking at visibility as a huge thing and trying to get it classified as a primary human health problem. Because, you'd be depressed if you were driving along and couldn't see the mountains out there. So anyway, like I said, I'm almost too appalled to say anything coherent, but the idea of a 5-year cycle is kind of frightening when we're just looking at the impact of one cycle, and there's no indication that the cycle will stop.
The one thing about the 5-year cycle that I think was a little disappointing is EPA has had 5 years, or in this case, maybe 7, depending on because the reconsideration, and they weren't able to identify more known controls to remove more of the uncertainty on this unknown controls, because it is such a big issue.
Scott, one more question here. The time is obviously drives cost a lot. I think it's fair for you to use the earlier time periods because that's what people will be subject to. However, there are the bump-up provisions that allow folks to slide. They have increasingly stringent controls. And so did you do any sort of sensitivity analysis with respect to the imposing those additional controls? Of course, they're probably going to be imposed anyway through the unknown, or something like it. But versus the added time of compliance.
We did not consider any bump ups from moderate to anything more severe. As discussed effectively, we did reclassify a lot of the marginal to moderate if it was going to be the case where by waiting the 3 years, the baseline emissions coming down would reduce the costs.
We have some questions. Lana?
Hi. So Alina Kraft with Environmental Defense Fund. I'd just like to comment that I think NRDC did a good review of your original report, and it's on their website, and I would encourage folks here to review that analysis. I think a couple of things. EPA has historically overestimated costs, according to Harrington, who have looked at rules over the years. And so if you look at, and I think there are plenty of examples where there were unknown controls that were required to meet a standard, an upcoming standard. I think, you know, the estimates seem wildly inflated, I think in part because of the assumptions that were made. I mean, you know, no part of the Clean Power Plan will be going forward between now and 2025 or 2022. I feel like that's an exaggeration, I guess. And then again, just to point out that this is all based on 65 part per billion. The proposal is 65 to 70. And then for those of you all not from Texas, the state actually has what they call Texas Emission Reduction Plan that funds the turnover of diesel equipment. They have been wildly successful in that program. It's oversubscribed. Their average costs for per ton NOx reduction is around $5,400. Right now, there is close to $1 billion in the Texas Emission Reduction Plan that's sitting at the state treasury that has not been spent on clean air projects in the state. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out as some of the perspective in terms of things that are already ongoing to address some of the emissions here in Texas. Thanks.
Okay. I think with respect to Clean Power Plan, particularly when we're talking, you know, 2022, which is really when we're saying emissions need to be in place, Clean Power Plan as proposed, the emission reductions would begin in 2020. That's probably gotten the most pushback, and I think most people expect that the early reductions will decline in the final rule. I don't know that anyone has any idea how much. But to the extent that it gets litigated and delayed, I can see a decent probability that there are no reductions, whether it's delayed or found to be illegal under the Clean Air Act. So I think there is a case to be made that it isn't there, that there is a case to be made that there will be something there. I think to your point, you have to use the microphone.
Oh, I guess I would just respond that I don't think every state is intending not to submit a plan. And I think even without having a final proposal on a Clean Power Plan, you know, states are doing things to plan for a Clean Power Plan. So things like demand response, things like smart grid technologies, those initiatives are being deployed. AB 32, there's tons of money being spent in California to turn over different types of fleets. So
AB 32 is in the baseline.
Okay, but I'm just saying that, you know, the idea that no state would be doing anything that would help them as part of the Clean Power Plan, I just don't think is a reasonable assumption. This is just my opinion. So
Right. I
just
think it's
saying.
a fair opinion. There certainly could be some states that do something. The question is if they're in non-attainment. And I don't know the correlation between the two.
Well,
So-
at 65, though, you know, you've indicated that most of the country would be out of attainment. So presumably, those would be, you know,
Right.
going toward the benefit.
I think there's definitely uncertainty there, so.
Andrew Hoeksma, Capital Area Council of Governments. I appreciate the analysis. I think there is definitely a value in trying to show, first of all, increasing costs of marginal abatement rather than just saying $15,000 per ton. The TERP program is a good example of both cost-effective reductions now, but also increasing costs of abatement. The costs over time, by definition, are going up because you're having to, you know, replace newer, cleaner trucks with basically, you know, a clean truck, but you're getting less emission reductions for the same capital investment. So that I appreciate that perspective. I think sort of as you move forward with these kind of analyses, the few suggestions that I'd make, I think the point about the timing and the sort of real-world application of this, the way I would couch this is the cost of meeting, you know, the Clean Air Act requirements by the letter. The reality is, you know, somebody facing those costs, a state facing those costs would say, well, shoot, I'll just bump myself up to serious or severe because I'm not going to have to do all of that. I can just wait until 2030 or whenever when you get more fleet turnover and not have to actually put, you know, $200,000 per ton controls in. The other points I'd make are the inspection and maintenance program is more costly than $15,000 per ton, but it is something that I didn't see in this analysis as a control option. It's, you know, more than $15,000, but less than $250,000. And then finally, you know, I think that the other point of data that is useful is the Houston emissions banking and trading costs. I mean, Houston is very tightly controlled for NOx emissions. You know, the cost of a ton of abatement there, or a emission reduction credit, is not $250,000. It's more like $100,000 or $150,000. So, you know, all of these things are unknown, but I guess my point is there are a couple other data points that might be valuable to you moving forward with this analysis.
We did look at the Houston, the MECT cap, and we also looked at controls in the Houston, the counties covered by that, basically the known controls. TCEQ, I think, as part of the 2010 Houston RACT or RACM analysis, looked at further tightening of that cap, but the tons that they looked at, it was less than the tonnage that was in known controls from EPA. So we decided not to do that additional. We felt that would be double counting. I think.
Roger McCall in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Fascinating presentation. Know that he's from New Mexico. We have a saying in New Mexico, poor New Mexico, so close to Texas, so far from heaven. These are staggering numbers, but help me get a grasp on that. If these were calculations in New Mexico, I could quickly make two comparisons. What's the gross domestic product, state of Texas? And what's the current annual state budget of the state of Texas?
The state budget, I have no idea. Okay. 200 billion. With respect to gross state product, Ann will be, I think, talking about some
Great,
gross
thank
state
you.
product related issues, at least the changes from the policy.
Okay, I'll first check my notes on the gross state product of Texas, but I think it was 22 billion, but that doesn't sound right if the state budget is 200. Anyway, I'll check it before, but I just wanted to add a couple comments in response to the questions or the comments that we received. Andrew, it's helpful to hear about the additional ideas such as I&M. And it's true, we didn't actually incorporate it into our unknowns. But I wanted to be clear, our unknown controls aren't all priced at $234,000 a ton. That's the marginal cost at 40% reduction of all the remaining emissions. And so how much you have to reduce, how much each state has to go down up that marginal cost curve depends what its average cost per ton is in our analysis. So it's nowhere near 234,000 per ton. And I wanted to comment on the CPP and the issue of climate policies affecting this. We actually did look at where the tonnage reductions are of NOx from the CPP, from the analysis of the CPP, wherever the person is who made the comment. And we looked at where the tons of NOx reduction are that are needed to attain the 65 ppb NAAQS, which is location specific. And they didn't overlap at all well. There are actually very different incentives under the CPP as to what plants would close down, which coal-fired power plants would close down, than the incentives that are based on getting NOx down at the lowest cost per ton. So there really isn't an overlap there, which suggests there's not all that much cost savings, even if we were to include the CPP in the baseline. I guess the additional point on that is that the CPP really is only applying to the electric sector, and these NOx controls apply across the whole economy. I think as Scott's presentation made it pretty clear, most of the additional reductions after you've closed down the coal-fired power plants that are needed to be closed down are coming from mobile sources, and that's not what the CPP addresses, and that's where the unknown controls are coming from.